Again, welcome again to part 2 of Talking Toxics. Next slide. So thank you for those of you joining us by the WebEx. Just a reminder, we are recording now. We'll let you know when we do this, but we'll stop the recording at the end of the presentation to allow time for extra questions at the end. So in case you don't want to be recorded asking a question for any reason, you can hold it to the end. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to ask questions as we go. And you can use I think there's a raise your hand function, as well as enter something into the chat box. And if you have any other questions or you want some of the workshop materials, you can always email me. And I think you all have my email now. So what to expect for today? We already went through introductions, a quick recap from part 1, and then Chris will take a deeper dive into the cleanups and talking more about toxics. So he'll go over some of the commonly encountered contaminants, some of the common remedies to address these contaminants, a little bit more on the disproportionate cost analysis and determining which cleanup action is selected ultimately. And then we'll transition into how you can make your voice heard with a meaningful comment. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with any lingering questions or what else you might want to learn about. And then we won't do it today, but I'll email out a survey just so that we can better understand how we can better serve your needs and what you guys want to learn more about in the future. And so day 1, we talked about what is Mott-cuh. I hope everyone remembers what Mott-cuh stands for starters. Acronyms can be pretty obnoxious sometimes, but Mott-cuh stands for Model Toxics Control Act in this case. And then we also talked about the Mott-cuh process. So starting with the initial investigation all the way through the monitoring and site use controls. Where all those orange bubbles are on that slide, that's where there's opportunities for public comment. Next slide. And then here's a image of one of the handouts that we gave out last week. We can also provide digital copies of that. They're also available, I think, on the Ecology website. But some of the other things that we talked about were public participation, some of the useful tools, and then we went over that junior site manager exercise. And so I guess real quick, because we only have a few folks on the call, did you guys have any questions lingering from last week that maybe you slept on it and it woke you up at 2 a.m. that you suddenly had a question? I just want to check in real fast if there's any questions. If not, I think we'll move right along.
All right. Seeing if there's anybody unmuting their mic.
Thank you.
I don't think so. All right. So kind of jumping into this week's of our workshop, I made some of these slides. Chris and I will kind of tag team on a lot of the content in in this bit of presentation. One thing to kind of mention when I say common contaminants is not necessarily to leave you with the impression that these contaminants that we list are everywhere. They're not common that you're necessarily going to find these at even every cleanup site. We do experience some common in terms of more frequently addressed contaminants, and that's where this list comes from. If you were to look at the larger share of our cleanup sites that we manage in the state of Washington, petroleum sites would rise to the top, if not even the very top, of the most frequently managed site.
By far.
Yeah, by far the top. So, in terms of what are common, petroleum contamination, sure. Metals, yes. We try to, at least visually for folks there, we've got more acronyms. The realm of contamination and contaminants is rife with lots of jargon and acronyms. So PAHs, CPAHs, PCBs, There's lots of acronyms to learn in this process, and these are some common ones. And instead of saying the long name, often as you coordinate and plan these meetings, any industry has their own jargon. So Chris will be able to kind of describe a little bit of, what are some of these things that we see, and maybe expound a little bit on where some of these are coming from.
Well, the list, as Ian was saying, the list is short here, but this really encompasses probably the largest amount, the largest percentage of contaminants that we deal with, certainly on a daily basis or weekly basis, that sort of thing. By far in the environment, the biggest problem we deal with are releases of different forms of petroleum hydrocarbon. That can be anything from a simple gas station tank leak to, I work on, for instance, a major pipeline pumping station in North Whatcom County that supplies the 4 big refineries here in Whatcom and Skagit County. But, and there's a whole laundry list of components in crude oil, organic chemicals, all sorts of stuff from paraffin to really exotic chemicals. But typically, it's simple TPH, a simple broad range total petroleum hydrocarbon that we look at first and try to identify. There are more specific compounds in petroleum hydrocarbons, like here it mentions BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. Those are volatile organic components of crude oil or petroleum compounds, and those are particularly notable because they can be pretty toxic, and we look at those pretty closely. Then there are other things that are not so exotic, like metals. Lead, arsenic, that stuff is pretty ubiquitous in the environment, whether it was placed there by human activity or not. Arsenic, for instance, is fairly common. It sounds and is nasty, in fact, but it's actually fairly common in the environment. It doesn't necessarily have to be the result of a cleanup or spill or something like that. Then there are other cases, for instance, down in South Sound, the old Asarco smelter down there, which operated for almost 100 years, broadcast lead and arsenic in its plume over about 200 square miles of South Sound. So there's a nice imprint of lead and arsenic all over the place down there. PAHs, contaminants are rife with organic chemicals. It helps to have a class in organic chemistry to even begin to read some of the stuff we have to deal with on a daily basis. PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, CPAHs, carcinogenic polyaromatic hydrocarbons, a whole family class of different contaminants that we deal with a lot. The CPAHs are particularly of concern because they cause cancer. Noticeably, the premier contaminant, benzoate pyrene, that's pretty nasty stuff. PCBs, that's polychlorinated biphenyls. Very, very, very common, unfortunately, in the environment. They were created by man. It's an artificial compound. It was invented about 100 years ago, 100 years ago. It was used for all different kinds of applications because, and for industrial purposes, it was very, very, very useful. It wasn't until much later, starting about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, that we began to understand that it was actually very, very, very bad for the environment. It's very long-lived. It doesn't break down, and it has human health effects. So there's literally a universe of different contaminants out there. Although, as I started with, these right here are some of the most common, and these classes, volatile organic compounds, metals, petroleum hydrocarbons, those are the basis. Those are what we really start from and encounter most commonly. So, if you want to get into that, I recommend taking a class in organic chemistry. But and each of these is dealt with. There are different cleanup measures and methods to work with these in different forms of environmental media. There are different health standards for these. They have different effects on the body and human health, have different effects in the environment. So it all gets very complicated. And trying to work with these all together and fit all this together in some sort of a comprehensive cleanup approach can be pretty complicated and time-consuming and difficult in places. So.
Yeah. So one of the things also to note, as we're describing some of these things that are complex, and the terms of public participation, that's where, being able to be a part of meetings and tours and reaching out to ask a little bit more information about this. Eleanor and Kirsten are a great resource at resources for that, and reaching out to Ecology to ask some of those questions as well. If you have questions, happy to pass them along my way. I'll help connect you to the right answer. We'll learn alongside you as well. So, yeah, please don't let some of those complicated things, necessarily be a barrier. We're here to help answer some of those questions. So, with a myriad of contaminants, there are many options for cleanup. And this is also not an exhaustive list of cleanup options. And really, one size doesn't fit all. Every site is a bit different. Every site has different contamination. There are different things in play that lead ultimately to what's selected for a cleanup. And we'll talk more about how that selection process goes in the future. Things that are highlighted here and that not totally be really visible for everyone, but 3 different of the bullet points: bioremediation, capping, and excavation of contaminated soil or sediment also in our examples. We'll be able to cover some of these things, see what they look like in real life around the Whatcom County area. We have a couple sites that are up in the Blaine Harbor area that'll provide some examples for this, and we'll walk through what the whole process kind of looks like in selecting that cleanup, as well as some examples that will be familiar for you all for capping from our junior manager activity that we did last week. But keep this slide, keep some of these links handy. The EPA has some really good websites that highlight what each of these options are and provide a lot more details for you all to learn about these different cleanup technologies.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, this particular slide is of course taken from someplace else. It's actually an EPA-based site, and I would recommend if you really would like to read up on this, the link that's included there. It's an excellent site with a whole variety of types of information. It's really a good reference. I'd recommend it highly. This slide points out there's no one way to approach a site. There are many different remediation technologies that depend on the environmental media that you're working on, medium or media that you're working on, the type of contaminants involved, time frames, cost, all different sorts of factors go into this. Although, as with the most commonly encountered chemicals I mentioned, there's really some very simple and effective ways that are most often used to deal with cleaning up sites. Evacuation or digging up contaminated soil. That's kind of a no-brainer, but believe me, that's the most common fix for simple contaminated soil sites. Capping, covering with some sort of either a permeable or impermeable cap on a site. That's very common. Bioremediation these days has gotten pretty sophisticated. It's a new technology. I say new, the last 20 years or so it's really come into its own, but it's actually very effective. And then you have some of these others that are listed here that are frankly pretty exotic and pretty interesting, certainly from a scientific and treatment standpoint, but they get pretty exotic, like phytoremediation. That's actually using plants to clean up a site. Permeable reactive barriers, that gets into some serious chemistry, some subsurface chemistry, very interesting, but pretty exotic. But again, we find that often the most effective cleanup are the simplest. Again, simple excavation of contaminated soil, or over here on the right-hand side, if you have groundwater, a pump and treat system where you're just pumping, groundwater's been affected by some contaminant. Well, you just basically pump that affected groundwater out, treat it, and then you can either return it or contain it someplace. It's really pretty simple.
Real quick, monitored natural attenuation I see is up on there, and that's something that commonly comes up, at least at our Bellingham Bay sites. Could you guys maybe quickly touch on that, what that is? Because I had no idea what
M&A?
Yeah, was until I got more involved in this.
That's monitored natural M&A, monitored natural attenuation, and that doesn't. That's actually fairly common in some sites and some places for some contamination. And it basically, I don't want to oversimplify, but basically it means let nature take its course. Because using Bellingham Bay as a perfect example, and contaminated sediments in Bellingham Bay, we found over time that in some cases, rather than go in and take active measures to try to remove contamination, dig up the bay bottom, stir up the creek, stir up the waterway, those sorts of things, the influx of natural sedimentation from the Nooksack and some other sources in the bay sort of given a little bit of time actually covers this stuff up, providing a blanket and isolating the contamination. And that's, in a lot of cases, a lot of times, that's actually the best treatment. In other words, let nature take its course. That's monitored natural attenuation.
So that is a wonderful segue into some of our next examples. So the folks joining on the call this evening, as well as for folks that would be watching, part 2. In part 1, we did an activity where folks took their best stab at going through the cleanup process as a site manager. And our case example was the Cornwall Avenue landfill in Bellingham Bay. So this site is a former municipal landfill, and it's pretty iconic and easily recognizable on the bay for its white tarps. So this is a great example of a site that capping is the selected cleanup alternative for this one. It's been carried all the way through to its engineering design phase and is awaiting the cleanup here coming up in the future. So a little bit of a recap of our, sorry, pun not intended on that. And that's where capping actually gets a bit confusing in our jargon. Yes, we're recapping a previous activity. CAP stands for Cleanup Action Plan as well in ecology. So, it's a multi-layer capping system that you see here on this slide, where the upland, the dry land, where the waste was disposed of, will have a multi-layer cap, and then there's a multi-layer in water sediment covering system as well. And then as a part of this, that monitored natural attenuation that Eleanor was mentioning and Chris was describing will be used as they supplement that process of adding different layers over in the water, and that's the blue portion here that you see, the G, H, and I labeled layers. Over the top of that will be deposited Nooksack sediment. So they're kind of giving it a jump start, and then there will be more added onto that as time goes on. Chris, I know you've had lots of experience working with landfills as well over the years too. Anything you'd like to add to this example?
No, this is not actually very exotic. It's certainly not the upland portion of it. The capping system that's proposed for this cleanup is very conventional, and actually, while this is being dealt with in our program, that is the toxic cleanup program, the landfill cover requirements actually come from EPA and the state's solid waste program, and they're conventional and it could be used for any site, whether it's in Bellingham or in a Soton at the other end of the state. And it basically involves a series of engineered lifts over the waste, including soil, an impermeable barrier layer, a drainage layer, and usually some sort of a leachate collection process. Very common, very conventional, and actually very effective if it's maintained. The devil's in the details. It needs to be constructed, of course, properly, and then maintained properly, but it actually does a very good job. The system as a whole does a very good job in isolating the waste material from the environment and preventing exchange with the environment.
Our junior managers from last week will be well familiar with this one. You helped create this in your simplified, quick activity, getting to the same goal here. So another example is an interim action, some dredging that occurred in 2004 on a site that's located along Bellingham Bay, the Weldcraft Steel and Marine. It's more on you think of the semicircle pattern of Bellingham Bay, more on the north side. of the bay and in Bellingham. So this location, it's kind of just more of a visual for you all to see. Also another straightforward removal. In this case, they were doing dredging on the site. Removed about 6,800 cubic yards of contaminated soil, and it was done in conjunction with some development that they were doing on this site. So Weldcraft Steel and Marine is ultimately still continuing along that cleanup process that we've been describing. But they did an early cleanup. Made sense to address something before they wanted to do some development at the site, which often happens in cleanups, and particularly for interim actions. If there's something that a case in point in time to be able to safely address something, then take advantage of that, do that, and then allow the rest of the site to go through that cleanup process in the whole fashion. So any additions to the story of what dredging kind of looks like?
Pretty simple, pretty basic actually. Very conventional. A common question we often have with cleanups is how the dredging is actually conducted such that contaminants aren't reintroduced or spread around while they're dredging. That's come up on a site I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. And the Corps of Engineers has some pretty stringent guidelines with how engineering guidelines with how that's to be conducted. And I know working with the Port of Bellingham, they follow that pretty closely because it's an obvious question, an obvious concern as you're dredging material off the bottom of the harbor that contains contamination. Are you in fact removing most of it, or are you also spreading it around at the same time? So how you actually affect the dredging, that's important, and how you manage the dredge materials as they're being removed is a big consideration.
So the next few examples will kind of really be, Chris's main focus. So Chris is the site manager for two of the highlighted sites here in the Blaine Harbor area, so the Blaine Marina and the Westman Marine. In Bellingham Bay, we have a lot of sites that are next to each other. In Blaine Harbor, there's a couple sites that are also right next to each other. So we've got some, just by happenstance, the way it worked, some other illustrative examples of different types of contamination, as well as some of the different methods that are going to be part of managing it. So as we go forward, Chris, a lot of these are some of your examples to lead from.
Yeah, this is really a 2-for-1 slide here. We have two of my sites which are adjacent to each other. This you're looking at an artificial. This is Blaine Harbor, Blaine Marina to the right. The city of Blaine is back to the right to the east. This view actually is looking northwest across Semiahmoo Bay. The city of White Rock, BC, is about 2 miles across Semiahmoo Bay from here, and that's the tip of the Semiahmoo Peninsula up in the upper left-hand corner of this photograph. This is part of Blaine Harbor process that went on for 60 years or so, with the Port of Bellingham and Blaine creating a marina and harbor space and on what used to be just tide flats here. So this island essentially that you're looking at here is completely artificial. It's built up of dredge fill, artificial material, wood pilings, and so forth. It's been used over a period of about 60 years for a variety of different uses. There have been different businesses on site out here. I'm working with two sites. The one in the upper left, Blaine Marina, that was a former marine fueling station, and the arrow is pointing. You can see it's a dark patch there. That's actually fresh asphalt, newly repaved. In the past, there was a marine fueling station there. There were 3 7,500-gallon above-ground storage tanks sitting there, and a piping and pumping system that supplied marine fuels, to the little dock that you can see just under the, under the arrow there, just under the building in the arrow there. Fish boats and some pleasure boats would fuel up there at the marina. They did that for about 60 years or so. Over the course of those 60 years, there were many spills. There was no big catastrophic release or anything like that, but process leaks where a valve would fail or a fitting would break or something like that, and they'd lose maybe 20 gallons, 50 gallons of marine diesel or some other marine-based fuel. Over time, that led to a big bubble of petroleum contamination that was sitting in the soil directly underneath the site. And so about 5 years ago, the Port of Bellingham, by the way, the Port of Bellingham operates the Port of Blaine, and the Port of Bellingham is the tenant, or I'm sorry, essentially the property owner for all of this property you're seeing here, and all of these businesses operate under lease to the Port of Bellingham. So the Port of Bellingham undertook a cleanup of this old Blaine Marina site. They deconstructed, they tore down the building summer before last, and then went to work and performed a remedial investigation to determine the extent, the nature and extent of contamination. It was really pretty simple. It was entirely petroleum hydrocarbons. And then they went to work. And in this case, it was a very relatively simple cleanup because what they did was just basically excavate down to ambient groundwater, which is it was roughly 15 feet or so below ground surface. And there was lots of contaminated soil. They pulled that out and removed it entirely and shipped it off for disposal. And the contaminated groundwater was sitting right there at the surface, of course, in the exposed excavation. They pumped out the contaminated groundwater and the product until they obtained clean results. Then they went back in and they filled up the excavation with clean fill. And in order to take care of some remnant contamination in some of the areas they didn't actually excavate, and those are areas that did have some petroleum contamination, but it wasn't above cleanup levels, they engineered a bioremediation system, a series of engineered trenches with a coarse media backfill and porous pipes that run through that, and they introduce, let's go down here to the next slide. So periodically they introduce a nutrient solution, and that's in these totes, these, you'll see on the left-hand slide, the white containers, that's actually a concentrated nutrient solution. They pump that into these big upright tanks here, these big storage tanks you see on the right here, in the background of the first slide and on the right here in the second slide. They mix it with water, and then they pump that solution into the ground, into these trenches. And the nutrient makes the local biota, the natural occurring bacteria that are in the ground, they go nuts. And they use a combination of the nutrient source and the remnant petroleum hydrocarbon as food and respiratory sources. And over time, it's faster than monitored natural attenuation, but it doesn't work overnight. But over time, these bugs actually destroy the petroleum hydrocarbon. It's actually very effective longer term and in most cases. And that's what's being used here. This process just began last fall. And in fact, I just got my first report on the site here just in the last couple of weeks, and we're pretty excited to see this working very well. So that's this relatively simple bioremediation combined with excavation. Very simple solution to this particular cleanup site. Go down here. More slides of the same process. This is just one of the big storage containment tanks here, and this is the pumping system, the piping and pumping system that's hooked up to introduce this stuff. This is what you're seeing on the right-hand side here is an engineered vault down into the substrate, and it meters this solution into these remediation trenches at a controlled rate over a period of time. And then they shut it off and they let the bugs work. Really interesting and very simple, actually. So that's Blaine Marina. That's been underway for a couple of years now, and we're real pleased with the progress. The other site, is so-called Westman Marine, and if you can, could you flash back to that overview of the two sites altogether? Could you do that real quickly? Yeah. So Westman Marine is there in the foreground, obviously, and that's a good overview site. Westman Marine occupies practically, that's the southeast corner of this built-up area, and Westman Marine occupies most of that site. You'll see right there in the center a slip. There's actually a marine railway where this is a small marine shipyard and boatyard, and there's what's called a marine railway in that slip. There's actually a railway system with a big winch and a platform. You can see the boat at the upper end of it there, sitting on a platform to pull boats up for maintenance and work. They run the platform down the rails out into the below tide, and the boat comes up and sits on the cradle on the platform and is secured, and then they winch the platform up the rails and up onto dry land there so they can do the work. And go back to the. So this is an overview looking down at the site here outlined in yellow, as you can see. This is a good overview shot. You can see the entire Blaine Harbor system here. All of it, as I said earlier, everything you're seeing there is created. The site used to look like down to the lower right there in that particular aerial photograph. You'll see it's just tide flats, tidelands, and that's the entire Drayton Harbor area looked like that 60 years ago. All of this that you're seeing there in that photograph, that aerial photograph, that's all been constructed. All that marina on top to the right there, and then of course the little island on the left where we're working on. So, and over time, Westman Marine, again, it's operated as a small shipyard, boatyard, off and on for about 50 years now, and through a succession of different ownerships. And their work involved simple or relatively simple and sometimes complicated ship and hull maintenance, working on the hulls, used compounds and anti-fouling chemicals and that sort of thing that were toxic and actually fell on the ground and so affected the upland where on the soil there. And then those activities actually contaminated the sediments, the nearshore sediments around the marine slip there. And so the Westman Marine site, unlike Blaine Marina next to it, is more complicated. We have upland effect in the soil. We also have effect out in the marine environment, in the sediment there, and we're working on the two different media at the same time. Interestingly, well, there's groundwater present at this site too. Groundwater is not affected at this site. There was no problem with groundwater. That was looked at during the remedial investigations to characterize any kind of effects or problems to groundwater, and there's none there. So at Westman Marine, we're working with uplands, the soil, and we're working in marine sediments. There's no groundwater component there. So this slide basically outlines where the remedial investigation has determined the contamination lies and the parts, the areas of the site that we intend to work on. That outline in red is where soil contamination exists and where the cleanup will concentrate. The green is marine. The marine is marine environment, affected marine environment and marine sediment, and that's where the majority of cleanup efforts will occur there. So the SMA just is the sediment management area, and I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It's just basically a management area, 1 B being the upland and 1A being the in water.
So one thing also just kind of remind as a recap from week 1, when we talked a little bit about doing a remedial investigation, an onward feasibility study, and carrying the cleanup process forward, the management of a site does not stop at a parcel boundary. So when you see a site that has lines drawn on it, that's based upon, in the case of this site, this document, this picture, this figure is actually coming from the remedial investigation feasibility study report. So when they did their testing, that's how the site's being managed and how the boundaries are being drawn up is based upon that initial, some of that earlier testing that's been occurring on the site through the remedial investigation.
So please let me say, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to speak up. I'm kind of rambling along here. If I say something or you see something in one of the slides that you have a question about, please speak up. Don't hesitate to say something.
So I kind of clicked through our next slide, gave you a little preview of what was coming up here next. So, as we're discussing this Westman Marine site, it was a really good case example to kind of walk through some of these steps and how we ultimately select an alternative, a cleanup alternative. So how do we get there? You've had testing, the remedial investigation done. Now in the feasibility study, this is where you start going through this disproportionate cost analysis. And what are those component pieces that ultimately help inform our different options that we're choosing from? So this is kind of a pie breakdown of the 6 different portions that these criteria, it's percent of the weight of what is actually going in through this DCA, or disproportionate cost analysis. The way I kind of envision some of this is you have lots of information coming through a sieve. And as a sieve, just like when you're trying to separate your noodles from the water, when you're making a pasta dish, as you're taking all of those details through, it has to go through this criteria weighting and the disproportionate cost analysis. And ultimately, as it, you put all of those details in there and you weight them, then ultimately it filters through to your different choices that you can look at. What is to note is, as we discuss all the different alternatives that are a part of a feasibility study, all the different combinations of technologies that we've discussed, all of them that make the final cut are protective of human health and the environment. They just accomplish that protectiveness in different ways and with different costs, and in some cases different technologies. So, kind of providing an overarching framework for this. Chris, do you want to kind of go into some of what these factors mean?
Well, it's fairly self-explanatory, really. As you can see, if you just do the math, 1, 2, and 3 there, overall protectiveness, permanence, and long-term effectiveness have the most weight. That makes up 70% of the analysis. That determines in large part the type of measures you're going to use. The other one, management of short-term risk, implementability, how easy is it to build and construct, and consideration of public concerns. Those are lesser considerations, although they are factored in. They only make up a total of 30% of the overall evaluation. But principally, again, the idea is overall protectiveness, permanence, and long-term effectiveness, because obviously you want something that's the most protective, something that's going to be permanent, and something that's going to have long-term effect. That's the most important.
Anything to add, Eleanor, to
I guess one thing that I would add is at the part 1 of this, I mentioned that there's the stakeholder, tribal, and advisory group that's meeting right now to update the rulemaking process, and this disproportionate cost analysis has been quite a huge discussion. So so with the Mott-cuh stagger stakeholder advisory group, it's there's a lot of feelings that this is a really great process and a great tool to use, but there's also a lot of ways that it could potentially be improved, but how it could be improved is still to yet be determined. But some of the things that they're hoping to incorporate into this is a little bit more of the environmental justice side of things. So is it next to an at-risk community? and would it better protect that at-risk community? And then also things like a little bit more about protectiveness of the environment, as well as more long-term things like natural disasters, as we start seeing more convergence of it's not just a hurricane hitting, but a hurricane plus a flood plus storm surge all kind of happening right at the same time.
Plus sea level rise.
Sea level, yeah, exactly. So they're trying to figure out how to incorporate that a little bit more into this.
Mm-hmm.
And if you folks who are listening to this in the future, the recording, or people on the who are listening in right now, if you're interested in providing feedback on this, I'm happy to share all the stuff. There's a STAG website where if you Google Mott-cuh STAG, you can probably find it pretty easily. All of the materials are on there, but I'm also happy to direct you because there's a lot of materials on there because this is not the only section that we're going over. But if there's things in here that you feel like could be improved on, I'm happy to incorporate your feedback in the comments that I'll be providing.
Yeah, I'd just like to throw in, so the Model Toxic Control Act is 30 years old, but it's a living document in that the program, the agency has gone in a couple of times with major revisions and rewrites, and there's an open process as just been described, there's an open process to look at elements that could be upgraded, improved, reincorporated, that sort of thing. So the agency's always interested, the program, Toxic Cleanup Program, is always interested in getting feedback and participation from the public and how this might work better.
Chris, we had a question. Kristen asked, if you could explain the difference between permanence, number 2, and 3, long-term effectiveness. What's the fine line of those being two different categories?
Permanence. Permanence is in my experience, permanence is intended when you have an engineered remedy. Is it something that's going to stay there? Is it going to last? Is it something that's going to stick around? That sort of thing. Effectiveness is just exactly that, a combination of the type of remedy, how well it's working, is it working long term, over time, that sort of thing. It's kind of a fine line there, but that's how I'd look at it. Does that make sense?
Right. Kristen says yes on that. Another question from Marie. Curious about the definition of protectiveness. Is this like how effective the treatment will be in protecting the surrounding environment from further contamination?
I'd have to say yes. Yes.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think one thing that I like to think about this is that it's really about eliminating the exposure pathways. So that because that's
part of it, certainly, yes. Mm-hmm.
With my environmental toxicology background, the dose makes the poison. So it's really if it's capped and no one can be exposed to that contaminant, then it's really not a high risk. Whereas if that contaminant is left out and people are there to experience that exposure, then it becomes high risk. And the other thing that I would like to add too is that the CCA, I think, for me, it seems like it's been really helpful to better understand it in terms of looking or reviewing the feasibility studies when they give a whole bunch of alternative cleanup remedies, and then one's picked out of those, and understanding really why that one out of all 6 or however many there might be. And so we felt like this was an important thing to include in this workshop.
Thank you, folks that are joining in for the questions. Keep those coming. And I'll try to make sure that we're checking that here on our chats coming in. So as we move along, we'll see how this translates for the Westman Marine site. So the Westman Marine site has completed its feasibility study, and the different methods and the different cleanup technologies have been evaluated. Going through that DCA, the disproportionate cost analysis, and we come up with some different alternatives to select. So this is a breakdown, simplified of, when you kind of look at a kind of meant to mimic, like say a cell phone plan, or you're trying to pick the best your option. Here's what a breakdown looks like for alternative U1. That's the Upland Unit 1, 2, and 3. And then we'll see on a breakdown where those costs lie and how we ultimately selected that. So, Chris, do you want to expound on some of what these alternatives look like?
Well, it's the diagram's fairly self-explanatory. They're fairly close. The differences being excavation is involved in all of them. The different alternatives do differ in the amount of soil excavated and the type of containment after the excavation is in place. Clean soil in one option, paved with asphalt in another, and the most extreme alternative is basically excavate everything, excavate all soil. So those all go into the mix, and I'll go into the next slide. Actually puts together the alternatives. And this is the result of the disproportionate cost analysis. This is a histogram. The bars represent the, in this case, the green is the relative overall benefit, and then the orange is the cost. And you can see the, when those are weighted and averaged, you get a number. And in this case, using this diagram, you can see that the first alternative has the best combination of cost, lower cost, and environmental benefit. It makes it the best choice, and that was the choice that was made for cleanup on this site. The third alternative off to the side over here would be effective, but it would also be extremely costly, and as you can see, the net environmental benefit wouldn't be that great. So all of these factors go together in trying to make a choice, and this is how it looks when it's finally evaluated. Does that make sense to everybody?
One other thing that is kind of a Mott-cuh, yeah, we've had a yes in there, is the lingo of permanent to the maximum extent practicable. So that's a line directly from Mott-cuh. So we've went through the DCA. Permanence is a part of that, and practicable to the maximum extent possible, or permanent to the maximum extent practicable. So what's practical is also something that this DCA process helps us select. And we have this set of boundaries that we're doing this process through, this guidance and framework. So for this site, we did that for the Upland, and then also the same sort of process for selecting what to do in the marine units. So there was a breakdown of marine unit 2, 3, and 4. Why there wasn't a 1 in that?
Well, there was.
Was there a 1?
So there is an M1. There was an M1. There was originally an alternative M1, and that was actually dispensed with. They evaluated that alternative and decided not to even look at it any further. And that was because it had to do with, without getting into the details of the alternative, the benefits wasn't cost, but actually the environmental benefits of that alternative weren't very great, and it would be very difficult to engineer and implement and maintain. And so they didn't take it any further. They just dispensed with it altogether and concentrated on the other alternatives, in this case 2, 3, 4, that they had. So you don't see M1 show up here.
So this one's pretty similar, self-explanatory. Kind of is a breakdown of dredging in the alternative 2 and 3 is proposed harbor-wide in 4 versus specific management areas. We also touched earlier on what this monitored natural attenuation or recovery is referred to in this case, and then what it means as far as replacing and temporarily necessarily removing things, and then monitoring for compliance. When there is not something like a site use control or some sort of monitoring, those are only excluded from options when the contamination has been completely removed. So like the Upland option didn't have any sort of stipulations on land use that's needed because the contamination would have been completely removed. In this case, for dredging, if you do harbor-wide dredging, there isn't a need for compliance in that because you've removed it all. So that's, some of the logic of how some of the alternatives come about.
Real quickly, it's a really simple answer, but could you quickly explain the difference between sediment and soil? Because some people might miss that nuance.
So, sediment, this is your outreach person giving you this response. So sediment is in water. That's something that would be deposited, like in our example, we were talking about the Nooksack River depositing sediment in Bellingham Bay. It's bringing down eroded material through the river and depositing that. Once that eroded material in the creek starts losing some of its speed, then it settles down into the bay. Soil, that's dry, and that's what makes up on land. And I'm oversimplifying something.
No,
a hydrogeologist in a room smiles at.
I could get into terms like regolith and all that sort of thing, but soil is at the surface on dry land, and sediment is basically soil that's transported in water and redeposited. Simple as that, whether it's in a freshwater or marine environment.
When you see sediment in these cleanup action plans, it's usually referring, or almost always referring to something that's in water, versus
yes.
Soil is referring to something upland.
That's right.
And when you are seeing something about a cap of sediment in water, that's sand that's placed in the water. So that's kind of where you get that dry substance added into the wet environment of the water. So you can kind of see where some of those uses of terms and descriptions become unique in this process.
Sand is most common. They also use cobble for anti-erosion because it has mechanical properties. It's resistant to erosion and wave action and things like that. There can be a variety of different media.
So Lisa had a question. She said, with the cleanup options at Westman Marine, were the birds and other animals brought into discussion how you made decisions?
That's interesting you should mention that because a local group was concerned or very interested in how this cleanup might affect bird population in Drayton Harbor. And that wasn't directly addressed as part of the cleanup, but the Port of Bellingham keeps an eye on bird populations in the marina. I know they do. And well, again, it's not specifically part of this cleanup. They keep an eye on the gulls and cormorants and other avian population around the harbor itself, because not just for cleanup purposes, because it also can affect or influence activity in the marina itself. So the port of Bellingham, City of Blaine, actually do keep an eye on that. I don't know. I don't have specifics on that program, but it is something that's taken into consideration generally.
There's also, so a lot of, at these cleanup sites, there's certain standards that the cleanup has to reach. So certain like concentrations of contaminants, for example, and those concentrations are typically set to be protective of both human health and the environment. So more specifically, if we're talking about sediment, those sediment standards would most likely be set for benthic organisms that are most highly exposed to those, but they also might be organisms that things like the birds might eat too. And so the idea would be that it should also be protective of the birds. But that's something that's always good to, note in your comment and be on the lookout for, because sometimes those things could potentially get missed, or there might be a special circumstance at that particular site that wasn't captured in the other standards that were set or something like that.
Lisa, did that answer your question? either speak a response or even type it if that works for you. All right, she says yes, thank you. So kind of moving on, the couple of the process, the options are, and here's what it kind of looks like as far as that MTCA cost-benefit analysis.
And again, I have three histograms here, and the green being the environmental benefit and the brown or orange being cost. And you can see the M4 alternative on the right there, which basically involves dredging the entire harbor, is very, very expensive. And also, interestingly, the environmental benefits weren't that great. I mean, they didn't completely eclipse the other two the alternatives. And the alternative that was chosen in two, combination of, again, a combination of cost with best environmental benefit, that's what's going to be used.
So before we kind of move on to the next section when we talk about submitting effective public comments, just want to pause and see if folks had some questions on what we've discussed here so far on some of these cleanup technologies and some examples from our sites. It's been great to ask questions all along, but we want to see before we kind of transition to the next part.
Well, you guys might be thinking, one thing that I would just quickly add is that hopefully by now, I don't know what your first impressions were of cleanups, but hopefully by now you understand a little bit more about why cleanups don't necessarily mean full removal of all of the contaminants. Some of the other things that are considered in this process, and correct me if I'm wrong, is not just what is the overall benefit of doing the cleanup itself, but what about the cleanup process too? So if you are removing all those materials, what is the carbon footprint of driving and trucking all of that removed sediment material up and over to the eastern side of Washington State or far, far away? What are those impacts too? So cleanups don't always mean full removal of all of those contaminants, as I probably once thought when I first got involved in this process. And then, so sometimes there's other remedies that are involved that we covered today that are equally as protective, because when you remove things and put them elsewhere, they then become another problem somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. You're just displacing the problem.
Right. And sometimes there is a good case for doing that, but that's why there's all these alternates that are presented so that it's more easily understood why certain remedies are picked over others.
Well, as folks may have some questions, you can always interject here. So we'll kind of do a little bit of a shift to on our agenda for what's next. So we've learned about how this process goes, how we arrive at some of these different alternatives. But just want to also kind of remind folks that all of this process, and particularly the results of those alternatives, those are shared through a comment period, a public comment period, and it's an opportunity for everyone to learn about that and submit comments on that. So how do we go about actually effectively making comments? And so in this slide, it's kind of a recap of a simplified view of what this cleanup process is. And those bright orange cleanup bubbles are those opportunities that, with the Model Toxics Control Act, are built in and required to do comment periods for. So, we were describing from a site on the Westman Marine that had finished the remedial investigation and feasibility study. You'll notice in those orange or light yellow boxes, you've got those orange bubbles there. What's coming up next for that site would be the cleanup action plan. That will also be another opportunity for public comment. And after the cleanup action plan, then they'll be working on the engineering design, securing the permits, cleaning up that site. But in that process of doing that underneath another legal agreement, usually that's done underneath a consent decree that's tied to that area of land and lines out those final details between ecology and in the Westman Marine site, the port of Bellingham. That legal agreement, when it goes out for public review, is also available for commenting. So there's just many opportunities within this cleanup process that are built in for public comment. And how do you make the most of those opportunities is really what this next section is all about. So we've kind of alluded to this a little bit, and we've covered it, but I just thought it might be another opportunity to kind of see what sort of ground rules and the approach that I'm speaking, I work for the Department of Ecology, I represent the big G government, and how do we, what sort of agreement and ground rules do we all function by, and how effective are these public comments, and how can you increase that effectiveness and feel effective? So in essence, really, we're kind of coming from two different directions in the same way, where when the public has an opportunity to comment, the quote there, "protective of human health and the environment," is directly pulled from Mott-cuh, whereas the community wants that. They want a protective cleanup for their health and the overall environment. And that's the goal of ecology and how we go about our cleanups. But we all kind of filter through those hopes and those goals through the framework of Mott-cuh. And as we touched on in part one, this is something that was a public initiative in 1988, made into law in 1989. There were two initiatives, one that was industry-based and one that was public-based. And the one that passed the vote, and now we're at our 30th year celebrating Mott-cuh, it was voted for by the public.
It was Initiative 97. I was on the ballot in November 1988. I'm proud to say that I voted for it right here in Bellingham.
And we all are a recipient of a progressive state environmental law in the state of Washington, and that law is what guides ecology's work. So as we accept comments and we work through our management, it's through the lens and through the filter of Mott-cuh that drives and directs where our cleanup goes, and ultimately leads to a cleaner home for us all, a cleaner environment. So we all want to make sure that this is done publicly, because we are a public agency that serves this community. How can the community affect this process? How can you actually submit effective comments? So the link that's above there is some tips that we have from the Department of Ecology on how to submit effective comments. These will also look very similar to the next slides that come from a federal level, and are more EPA centric, but they're very similar. So I hate to have a little bit of death by words on a PowerPoint slide, but please visit that link at another time, and a lot of these bullet points are pulled directly from there. So what helps this community? It's all about how you communicate. So what helps us as the Department of Ecology and our site managers to respond to you, and what can you do that helps that response go smoothly? So identifying what document you're commenting on, and specifically what section you are. So when you would like to comment based on some specific issue or topic of the document that we're putting out there, actually telling us where that is in the document that you're addressing really helps focus our attention. That way we're all actually functioning on the literal same page. Very thick, big documents in many cases, very technical. Some sections that cover the summary, and specifically the cleanup alternatives. There's certain sections that really kind of boil down a lot of the research and planning that's involved. Referencing any and all of those sections in your comment helps us as ecology to know where to respond. Being concise, but really supporting your arguments. And even, I think on my next slide, citing where that kind of comes from. I don't know if I really mentioned that there, but when you can back, where your arguments are and how that would be affecting you in this decision that is coming across for you to review, letting us know where that comes from provides a point of reference. Once again, we're all talking on the same page that way. And this first point here, where please describe your expected impacts. So these cleanups affect our community, and as you can submit your comment for what that effect means to, say, your business, or as expected for what that effect would be to the community, allows us to be able to put in context what your comment is. Examples really help support that as well. And here's where the reference point was, the third bullet point or check mark down. You'll see in the, we'll have some examples from some of Resources' past comments on cleanups, and they do a really great job of citing where that documentation is coming from. And this one may seem like a no-brainer, the very last check mark, but submitting your comment by the deadline announced and in the way that we help give you options allows us to be able to capture all the comments within a formal comment period. So we typically will open up a comment period for at least 30 days. So when we open up a comment period, we try to get all our outreach in advance of that. Many different ways in which we reach out to you. Mailers, newspaper ads, and if you self-select, I'll send you an email personally to your email account too. But then submitting your comment within those 30 days allows us to capture all of those comments and then respond to those and address those at one time. Comments that are submitted outside of formal comment period won't get that package with all the rest of the comments. That would be viewed just like a normal correspondence, phone call, email, or something about a site. But for it to be captured in this formal process within the start date and end date is really, really helpful. So kind of repackaged in a different way, but I think it kind of goes to show the point that, what is an effective comment to the government overall. It can be quite imposing to reach out, and I know in this scenario of this capturing on, online this evening, but you are reaching out to real people that are really reading these comments. So, just kind of reiterating what regulations.gov, and this is a website, the PDF that's referenced there is a great handout, covers in greater detail from what I'm kind of sharing in these slides, but some of their suggestions is, and it seems also some self-explanatory things, but really reading and understanding the document you're commenting on. Often we will get comments that may not necessarily relate directly to the comment period that we have opened or the documents that we have put out for review. We, of course, those comments are welcome to be shared. We'll read those. Our ability to respond in the comment period of topic in those documents is a little bit challenging. So being able to focus those comments on the documents that we have for review is really, really helpful. And feel free to reach out. I've had an opportunity a couple different times for folks in the commenting process that they need a little extra help. Where should they go? How should they navigate our online comment form? Happy to help out with those and help you be able to make those comments. Similar thing that what we had for our ecology guidance, be concise, support your claims, providing sound scientific evidence, providing that reference where you're coming from, and that could be as simple as a website link that we can follow. And entering into this conversation of addressing trade-offs, you're allowed to submit a comment that does have an opposing view. It helps in that comment where you can, have continue that conversation of what those trade-offs look like with that opposing view. No minimum or maximum length for an effective comment. Sometimes an effective comment can be a matter of just a few sentences, and that sort of response, can be a well-coordinated amongst our team sort of response. Sometimes longer ones, doesn't necessarily, the length doesn't mean that you have to write a, multi-page report on your comment. And then something that is an interesting thing to note that regulations.com kind of covered was, or regulations.gov, was the comment process is not a vote. One well-supported comment is often more influential than 1,000 form letters. So in real life, what the practicality of this is we often get a really well-articulated comment that is hopefully a well-articulated response. And we dive into what that comment is really getting at and then respond to that. Having multiple, an order of hundreds or thousands of form letters doesn't translate to that being a vote for the change of an action. So what often happens in comment periods is if we have it open that if folks are really wanting some more information and they would like to have a public meeting, upon 10 requests or more, we'll hold a public meeting during our comment periods. That's where one of the cases of there's a number assigned to the number of comments that are submitted. And that's just, how Mott-cuh is originated. In many cases, we'll schedule meetings when we anticipate there being a public community need for that information. But if we didn't, and the community would desire to have that meeting, submitting that comment, that's where the number is actually important there. But the form letter of sort of a vote is kind of a misconception on how the comment process goes. So what are some effective comments? What do they look like? So the example there in front of you is a comment submitted by Kirsten McDade of Resources. So thank you, Kirsten, for your example here. And just kind of walking through this comment, what are some things that stood out based on those suggestions? And there's many things in here. There's not enough actual screen space to kind of highlight all of those. So one thing is the date. So Resources comment fell within our 30-day comment period. So it filtered into our response to this as well. And then Kirsten highlighted one specific section of the remedial investigation feasibility study. It was a section on tides, flooding, storm surge, and tsunamis and climate change. Helped us direct kind of where it was. And then she highlighted, what her stance was. And also, as you can see with the footnote, provided where that research was coming from on where that stance was. So those sort of highlights there, really, that's what an effective comment can look like. That enables the response a lot more streamlined.
You can talk about this if you want.
Go for it.
Okay. I thought it might be nice to include a few example comments. So here's one on sea level rise that was included by a City of Bellingham staff member on the INJ waterway comment period in regards to an expected sea level rise of 50 inches. And so I'll give you a moment to read that. But in summary, the city encourages support and ecology to consider using 50 inches for the head of the waterway unit and project boundaries, beach restoration, and site protection. And so that was her comment. So something to keep in mind is that with all the comments that you submit, there will be a response ecology. So on the next slide is the response that ecology provided to that comment, where they said that they would work with the Port of Bellingham and Bornstein Seafoods, who were part of the potential liable parties for that particular project, to evaluate the applicability of the 50-inch sea level rise estimate to the cleanup. And so that's one example of a comment. And I would like to remind you all too that these are all available online too. So if you go onto Ecology's website and go to the Bellingham Bay cleanup sites or other cleanup websites too, you can find all of these responses as well as comments available.
So I really appreciated this example too, because it illustrates another aspect. When we open a comment period as Ecology, the community that comments has a public community component of that, but also other agencies and other government municipalities can comment as well. So it is open to whomever has a comment to submit. So it's a mechanism in which agencies can contact and kind of comment to each other. It is also something that's open for the community. In our commenting open comment periods, we have an online system that is highlighted in all of our fact sheets and on our web pages and all of our outreach. And you can see those comments come in live for anyone who uses the online system. For folks that would mail something in, or that would email a site manager, those ultimately will make it online, but they'll be manually entered at a later time. So just kind of a side note for everybody, yeah, it's the larger community that's actually commenting on this.
Yeah, and I think there are ways to submit comments anonymously too, if you would prefer to not have your name associated. There actually was a name associated with this comment, but I figured this person, so you can find it available online, but I figured this person didn't expect to have their name associated with this comment in this presentation, so I left it out. So here's another example comment regarding natural disasters, more specifically earthquake and tsunamis, and this was on the Cornwall Avenue landfill on the engineering design report, which during the last meeting we commented on how the engineering design report is typically not something that is open to public comments, but in this case there was such a huge public interest in it that it was, there's a special case made in this case, so there were public comments on it. So here this person asked, what happens to the site, Cornwall Avenue landfill, in severe conditions such as earthquake or tsunamis? So the thing that I want to highlight here too is that this person had, a specific question, but they didn't necessarily, so it's nice if you can read the whole document, but this is sort of a more open-ended question, so you don't have to read through the 900 pages of the technical document to necessarily provide a comment. If you do have concerns, feel free to raise those questions too. So then the comment on this one was that, so they sort of separately addressed the earthquake in the, I guess, second paragraph, and then in the third paragraph, tsunamis, and what they actually do for those. So those are perfectly valid questions to have and to raise, and Ecology will address them.
So, in this example, you have a fairly detailed response back with things based upon studies. There's foot measurements of height, that are involved. That type of response is capable of being a part of something that's a little bit further along in the comment period. So, a site that's younger, if you think about that, earlier in the cleanup process, the ability for a site manager to answer an engineering question earlier in the process is more challenging. At the end, that's the point of doing the management and all of the planning. They'll have an ability to be able to answer this in a detailed fashion like you see here. So another great example of process understanding too.
So I included this slide too because we've mentioned that there's public meetings, so people who haven't been to one might not know what to expect. So one thing to remind folks is that this isn't actually a public hearing, so any questions asked at the meeting aren't necessarily recorded down, so you do need to submit written comments in addition to whatever you might state verbally at those meetings. They typically have been from about 6 to 8 p.m. The first hour is usually taken up by ecology staff for the Bellingham Bay sites, usually the port, city, and or consultant staff that co-present, which can be really great because those consultants can really get down into that nitty-gritty information of, where was that monitoring well put and why was it put there, whereas ecology, the port, and the city can answer all kinds of other questions too. The second hour is usually more open for questions from the audience, although usually you can ask questions as you go, but just to make sure that all the questions can be answered. Ecology and other staff usually will stick around till 8 p.m. If there's enough discussion happening. And like we've mentioned several other times throughout this workshop, they are always happy to follow up afterwards too if you have other burning questions or didn't feel like there was enough time, or you had a question that you didn't necessarily want to ask in front of everyone, or if you felt like you just weren't sure how to, later on, you weren't quite sure how to actually physically submit your comment and wanted more guidance on that. As I mentioned before, you must submit your written comments in addition to whatever is stated at those meetings. They are not public hearings. And as we mentioned before, they will all be addressed by ecology. And be sure to check on what the comment deadlines are, so that you don't miss that deadline. If you do happen to miss the deadline, oftentimes ecology will take your comment into consideration, but like Ian mentioned before, it won't be captured in that public document where every comment will be addressed, and it could be overlooked in some way, shape, or form. So I would definitely encourage you to make sure that you submit that comment during that open public comment period.
Really with what Eleanor was describing, it's not so dissimilar than what you're experiencing in this workshop. We started this evening's workshop at 6, kind of plan on wrapping it up at about 8, and we're doing a presentation and welcoming questions along as we go. So kind of similar in terms of a workshop and what you would expect in a presentation as well. And you can ask questions as you go along.
And then something that we've in recent years been trying to pair with some of those public meetings, or maybe if it doesn't seem like there's going to be enough people to show up at a public meeting, we might just do a site tour, but we've been trying to pair them together when we can, so that typically during lunchtime on a weekday, we might do a site tour where Resources hosts it and then invites other folks along. So in this photo here is actually a staff member from Bornstein Seafoods who's talking about their operations there at the INJ waterway to the public, as we did a tour of the INJ waterway. And so we try to do them during lunchtime, and then usually in that evening, if there's a public meeting, that public meeting would be after that tour, so that folks could potentially at least be captured in one event or the other, or go to both. The tours, we won't take you on any properties that are not safe for the public to go on. Sometimes we are able to gain access that isn't typically open to the public, but that's in a controlled environment where we aren't expecting any of our tour members to go off and eat dirt or something like that along on the tour. So we safely guide the public on site when possible, and have ecology, the port, city, and consultant staff there, like just similar to the public meetings that can provide more context and details of what is happening at that cleanup site. And those staff are also available for more questions, but really it's a chance to get the public out to that site and see, like when you look at the technical documents or the fact sheets and you see, okay, so this area is supposed to have a cap and this area is supposed to have removal, but what does that actually mean when you see it on a diagram? Seeing it in person can really ingrain that whole understanding. There was an example at our Blaine Marina tour where we were talking about the tracks and somebody asked, wait, so there's trains coming through here? And then we realized, oh, like there's tracks on there, but it's not for like the railroad like you would normally think of. It's for boat operations, moving the boats back and forth over the site. So it's a really great way for the public to interact and really get a better sense of, almost a more hands-on sense of what that what's going on at that site. And then for those who are interested, the public meetings are more PowerPoint presentation style, so a little less hands-on, but can dive a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of some of the more details. We do sometimes provide diagrams at those tours, but the PowerPoints can have a different they have different capabilities, and so the two paired together can go really well. So those are some ways that you guys can participate and help, and these are tools that can hopefully help you formulate some of your comments a little bit better. So ideally beforehand you would look at some of the materials and maybe come with questions, but I know that that's not always possible, so just showing up, hopefully we provide enough information that we can stimulate a productive dialogue that can lead to some really productive comments in the end.
This slide's really kind of a repeat of part one, just another opportunity to let folks know, captured in this presentation as well. How can you stay informed? I'm happy to add you to our Bellingham Bay email notice. That way when we have a comment period that's scheduled, potentially a public meeting or a tour, I can communicate that to you all directly, give you advance notice on that. And if you would like to have notification for things in the greater Whatcom County area, I'm happy to do that as well. One point of reference for Ecology's webpage, if you go to ecology.wa.gov and then enter in Bellingham Bay Cleanup, or you could just even in the search bar search for Bellingham Bay Cleanup. Either of those directions bring you to our webpage that you can then go to all the different 12 sites. And it's got contact information for myself, as well as some of the other staff that are part of managing the Bellingham Bay cleanups. And there's a resource at the very bottom. You can click a link for the cleanup process, the infographics that you've seen too. But really, join in person. Join some of this public outreach. Yes, we are in an era right now currently that doing online meetings is the best for public health and safety. But in the future, we will be able to return to doing some of those things in person and utilize this online option as best as we can too. What do we have here? So Eleanor asked me a little bit to provide a little bit of context for everybody with our coronavirus response. We switched this workshop to doing things more online. Our public meetings for the interim time frame have also been moved to online options for things that have been scheduled. So what does the future look like? That is changing every day. And in all honesty, Ecology follows federal, state, and local guidance as well for public gatherings. There are plans for our outreach. This cleanup process for many sites are continuing on. This spring and early summer, we hope to be able to do public outreach for other sites in the Bellingham Bay area. So when we get to that point of something occurring in, say, May or June, we will follow what the guidance says at that time. Things here in this next calendar month of April fall within our guidance of limiting larger gatherings limiting our in-person gatherings for meetings. But beyond that, we'll kind of see what that future holds on timing, and we'll adjust accordingly to whatever we can do to pivot and provide public access for our meetings and our outreach. So yeah, just kind of a heads up, we will let you know when those options are available and when that outreach comes up in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So we've been experimenting a little bit with WebEx because we last minute realized that this was going to be the option last week. We were able to provide WebEx and have our meeting in person, and this week things changed enough that we were not able to even do any in-person option. So I recognize that WebEx is not ideal and it's not meant for everyone, and sitting there for over an hour to 2 hours is a long time to ask of people to stare at their computer screen. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll open it up to questions and stop the recording before we open it up to questions like we promised in the beginning. But again, thank you so much, and stick around if you'd like to ask any questions.